The next element I wanted to develop in this track was the sub bass. When I wrote the string riff, I knew I wanted a bass line to punctuate in between the riff. So this is what I came up with. If I just solo the violin and my main sub bass. If you're not listening on good speakers, you might not be able to hear that bass because it's low. But through some nice big fat speakers or some good headphones, it really punctuates nicely between the violin riff. So I wrote the bass line. You can see it here. Here's the MIDI. It's very simple. It's really not complicated. It's not a lot of notes going on. And then I ran it through Massive and just came up with that warm sub bass sound, which is great, but a little bit boring. So I thought, how am I going to sort of make this more interesting? So one thing I sort of stumbled across is if I go to my mixer here, here's my MIDI. I've actually got Massive already loaded up. Let's run my demo. If I remember correctly, it was called Copper or something, Copperhead, I think it was. So let's just solo this and see what it sounds like if I can find it. Here we go. So a really strange, aggressive sound. But if I mixed it with my previous sub bass, let's bring it down in volume a little bit. You can see it's kind of crazy, but I played about with the synthesizer and found something that I really liked. So within Massive and a lot of synthesizers, you have these macro knobs, which are sort of the main basic features of that sound. And I think I found when I wiggled around this rise time here, and this full time, and this sync depth, I could get some really interesting sounds coming out of the synthesizer. So when you're wiggling around knobs like that, you've got to find a way to record that. And that's called automation. So within the synthesizer, this is how you do it within Pro Tools, and every bit of software will have its own sort of special way. If you click there, I'll just do that again so you can see. If you can click there on the synthesizer, it brings up this window. And these knobs here are called macro 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And as you can see, they come up here. And what you have to do is you have to add those across there. And then what that means is when I come to here, let's make this bigger so you can see. When I click there, this comes up Massive, which is synthesizer, and then the macro 1 to 8. And what that means is I can now, if I do that and we watch the synthesizer, let's bring up the synthesizer, watch this macro 1 knob. Can you see it moved up? If I set it to go down, it will go down. So if we look at my previous automation, which is here, you can see I just did a lot of crazy automation. That was macro 1, macro 2, macro 3, whoa, quite crazy there, and macro 8. So I did a lot of crazy knob movements, possibly not the greatest term I've ever used. And then I just bounced the loop of the track and called it Bass Copper, because that's the name of the synth. And this is what it sounds like. And if you mix that with the sub bass, and with the violin. Now, key thing to note when I'm doing this is I'm not doing it in solo mode. So I wasn't doing all these crazy macro movements just randomly. I was listening to the whole of everything that I had together. So with the sub bass and then with all the strings. And then kind of got the movements of the macro to what I liked that worked with the strings. Quite a crazy sound, but I thought I'm just going to store that, and I'm sure it will be really useful later and just make the track more interesting. But I still felt there was something missing within the bass, and that was kind of like I've got like this real low sub and this crazy high end thing, but there's not sort of a grit and a mid to it. So I made, using the same bass MIDI but a different synthesizer, I made this this more gritty bass sound. It's distorted and it's got a wobble to it. So then I could blend the 3 bass sounds together. And you suddenly have yourself a really interesting bass line. Notice how I'm not just relying on one synthesizer to get the sound that I want. I've used 3 different synthesizers there, and then I'm blending them all together. And obviously within my mix window I can change the volumes of things to whatever works for me. But I needed 3 different synthesizers to get the bass sound that I wanted.